Having yearly remembrances and celebrations to commemorate things is a very important part of human life. It helps us not only to remember, but place ourselves within history. This Sunday, we celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. And that's really what we could call the birthday of the church. And so this is a very, very important day in the church's calendar and yearly celebrations. So let's take a look at its biblical roots. Today's readings are from Acts chapter 2, the first really 11 verses, but I'm going to go to verse 13 because I think it gives us a little bit more context and a little bit more history. And especially in Acts chapter 2, verse 12, Luke records that the people who witnessed the Spirit coming upon the disciples then questioned, they said, "What does all this mean?" And that makes a really nice segue into this video. What is this text all about? So I hope you've got a good cup of coffee, and we're going to dig into the text. For those of you who are new to the channel, let me just introduce myself. My name's David Paris, and for the past 30 years, I've been teaching at the graduate level, doing theology, biblical interpretation, and New Testament studies. And the goal of this channel is hopefully for me to take some of that teaching, research, and writing and bring it to a much wider audience. So if you find these videos beneficial, be sure to hit that subscribe button below the channel. That way you'll know when new videos come up. And then the second thing is, be sure to share it with other people as well. Now, as I said in the introduction, most lectionaries only have this week's reading going from chapter 2, verse 1, up to verse 11. But I'm going to continue to verse 13 because it helps us understand this passage a little bit better and gives us some significance and thought about what the passage is all about. When the day of Pentecost had arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them, and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them. What's really remarkable is that when Luke tells us really the event of the day of Pentecost and the giving of the Spirit upon the church, he describes it in only 4 verses. And this is very, very typical in the New Testament, especially the historical books, in that the miracle stories are really boiled down and condensed to really sort of their bare essentials. Very, very simple stories, especially when you compare the stories in the New Testament to those in Greco-Roman literature, where miracle stories tend to go on for several pages sometimes. The other thing is that when we're looking at a narrative or a story in the Bible, you need to ask yourself some questions about sort of location, setting, and time. Now notice in this particular story here, Luke really doesn't tell us where this story happens. All that he tells us is that they were gathered together all in one place. And traditionally, if you see an artwork depicting this scene, they usually portray it as a room. But within the context of this story, it's probably better to see this as the disciples being gathered together in one of the porticos within the temple. And I'll show you why as we go through the text. The second thing is, we're not sure exactly how many people are gathered together. We're just told that they're all gathered together. The key thing is, he tells us when this takes place. And it's on the day of Pentecost. Now, the English word Pentecost comes from the Greek word Pentecoste, which really just means 50 or 50th. And it comes from Leviticus 23, verses 15 and 16. You shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. And then you shall present a grain offering of new grain to the Lord. So it's called the Feast of Pentecost because you have 7 weeks, 49 days, plus 1. Now the question becomes, how is Luke using this reference to Pentecost in this passage? If we compare it to the Feast of Weeks in the Old Testament, it was an offering of the first fruits with the promise then that God would bring the rains and bring the harvest later on in the season. Now, if Luke is primarily echoing off that idea, then at the very end of chapter 2, Luke tells us that some 3,000 people were added to the church that day. So this initial harvest of 3,000 people would then sort of echo or be an allusion to this idea of the Feast of Weeks or the Festival of Pentecost in the Old Testament. Now, there's a second way that he could be using this idea of the Feast of Pentecost in this passage, and that is as Jewish history progressed from the giving of the law down to the time of the New Testament, the Feast of Pentecost picked up a second big idea. The Jewish community saw the Feast of Pentecost as a day to commemorate the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. If that's the idea, then Luke is comparing the giving of the law on Mount Sinai when God gave the law to Moses so that the people of the Lord knew how to faithfully respond to the covenant that God had graciously instituted with Israel. Luke is then comparing that with God giving the Spirit to the church, which is going to lead, guide, and instruct the church. So we get this parallel between God descending and giving the law on Mount Sinai, and then in the book of Acts with the Spirit descending and filling the church. And so now we have this Trinitarian type allusion to the deity of the Holy Spirit being the third person co-equal within the Trinity. One final idea that we need to keep in mind is that the book of Acts is part of a 2-volume set, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was baptized at the very start of his ministry, and at the baptism, the Spirit descended like a dove from heaven and remained upon Christ. Here in the book of Acts, we see the same idea being brought across. The church's ministry begins with the giving of the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 2. Now let's pick up on that idea and press it a little bit further. In Luke 3:16, he says, I baptize you with water, but he who is mightier than I is coming, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. Now notice in this passage, we've already seen that the Spirit is going to come, described as tongues of fire. This is also described as a sudden rush of wind, a very, very strong wind that filled the entire house. Now remember, when we looked at Genesis 2, Ezekiel 37, and other passages, this idea of wind, breath, and spirit are all contained in the Hebrew word ruach, but they're also part of the meaning of the Greek word pneuma. And so here in this passage, the comparing or the description of the coming of the Holy Spirit as a wind fits right in with sort of what we would call the semantic range of this word pneuma or spirit. Now the Spirit of God is going to come on the church, but it's being described as a mighty wind. In verse 3, Luke describes this as a fire. So in verse 2, he describes the coming of the Spirit as a mighty wind. And then in verse 3, he compares it to a fire. Now, fire in the Old Testament was often a symbol of God's presence in a special manifestation. So when Moses is in the wilderness, you have the burning bush. When the people of God are being led through the wilderness, you have God being described as leading them as a pillar of fire. And I'll put some of the references over here so that you can look them up on your own, which I hope you're doing. And then the third way this descent or the filling of the Spirit is described here is that the disciples now speak or give utterance in other languages. Now the word that's used here is rather interesting because it's not the typical word for speaking, laleo, and it's not the typical word for like words, logos or rhema. Instead, Luke uses a very interesting word, and it's only used 3 times in the New Testament, and all of them in the book of Acts. 2 of them in this chapter, verse 4, and then I believe it's verse 14. Now, this word that's used here that we translate as utterances is often used in Greek literature to talk about sort of a divine oracle or a divine revelation being made through someone like a prophet or somebody like that. Luke is using a word that would have resonated within the early church to see what the disciples were doing here when the Spirit came upon them as sort of divine oracles or divine prophecies or divine utterances to the crowd. They just weren't walking around, speaking, hey, how you doing? Where'd you get the coffee? That sort of thing. Are you subscribed to my YouTube channel? Nothing like that. These are very sort of divine manifestations, and it speaks to the role of the Spirit as the one who comes and manifests God's presence among us. In this story, you have the coming of the Holy Spirit, and it is both given collectively to all the believers that are gathered together, but then it settles on each one. So there is unity, everyone, but then it's given to each individual. And then the second big point here is that it's a new model for redemption. And then number 3, that the church is the new instrument for God to take up the mission that He has called us to. And number 4, the church now parallels Jesus' ministry. Just as Jesus was baptized and the Spirit descended and then He embarked on His ministry, now in the book of Acts, the Spirit is given, poured upon the church. And now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, and saying, Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in his own native language? In verse 5, Luke now moves into the actual impact of the bestowing or the descent of the Holy Spirit. The first thing he tells us in verse 5 is, Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation. Now this is important because oftentimes people tend to read the Gospel or the book of Acts or other sections of the New Testament, and they tend to think of the Jewish community as being anti-Christian or legalistic or something like that. But Luke specifically tells us here that there were devout people from every nation living in Jerusalem. Now, these are Jewish believers he's talking about here. Verse 6 talks about the bewilderment of the crowd. They heard this sound. Now, remember at the beginning I said that the most logical place for this story to be taking place is not in an upper room, but probably in one of the temple courts, because this crowd of people from all these different languages heard this sound of the Spirit coming, and now they've drawn closer, or they've come over to find out what's going on. Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Galatia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongue the mighty works of God. Now, before I dive into where all these people are going to, one of the things I want to tell you about is the value of owning a Bible atlas. The one I often use in my videos and lectures is in the Accordance Bible software package. It's their atlas. But I wanted to show you here that when it talks about this, having an atlas, you can actually look at it and see where these people are from. And oftentimes this will help you unlock the meaning of a passage just by getting some good geographical information. But this also includes all sorts of historical information about what's taking place as well. I'm going to include a link to these atlases in the Show More section below this. Consider picking one of these up and adding it to your quiver. But I digress. Let's get back to the text here. So why does Luke spend several verses telling us where all these people are from? Well, I think it does 3 things. Number 1, it's going to set up the expansion of the church into these other regions as the book goes along. In other words, when the church moves from Jerusalem and Judea out to, let's say, Antioch or Damascus or into Asia Minor, This is not something that's being innovated by the disciples on the ground. This is very much part of the church from its very inception. The second thing why this is important is because all these people that are listed here means that they would have been bicultural people. They would have been Jewish by faith and practice, but then Greco-Roman by culture. They not only spoke two languages, but they would have grown up in that culture, so they would have brought that with them as well. Now, this is important for two reasons. Number one, it sets up the ministry of Stephen, Philip, and then later on Paul, who are all Greco-Roman by culture, but Jewish by faith. They are bicultural people. They are not like Peter, James, and John, which are monocultural. They are Hebrew by culture and Jewish by faith. The second thing it does is that these bicultural people are really the ones that are going to lead the major expansion of the church. In other words, they have the linguistic and cultural skills and abilities to take the church into new situations, something that Peter, James, and John then follow in their footsteps, but really don't have the cultural or the linguistic skills to do on their own. And then finally, it lets us know in no uncertain terms that from day one of the church, it is an ethnically diverse community. And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others mocking said, "They are filled with new wine." Now, as I was saying, I'm incorporating verses 12 and 13 into this because I think it has two important ideas that help us to understand this passage. In verse 12, it says, "And all were amazed and perplexed and were saying to one another, 'What does this mean?'" In other words, Luke incorporates that question. He didn't have to tell you that they asked that question. He incorporates it because what it does is it then provokes you as a reader to answer that question. And hopefully that by this point in time, you're able to answer that question as well. Or else I'm going to have to bang my forehead on this table in frustration. Don't make me do that. By saying that they are drunk with wine, brings up this idea that was very, very common in the Greco-Roman world and also in the Jewish world, that divine revelation was often compared with the effects of alcohol upon a person's life. Philo, who lived at around the same time of the Apostle Paul, wrote about how prophecy or being filled with the Spirit was very comparable to the influences of alcohol upon a person's life. Paul appeals to this same idea. In Ephesians 5:18, Paul writes, "Don't be drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit." And I think Paul might have this passage here in Acts chapter 2 in the back of his mind, or thoughts like what Philo writes as he wrote Ephesians chapter 5. How would you describe the influence of an invisible spirit upon a person's life? Well, obviously there has to be something within them that's controlling or influencing the way they think, act, and speak. And so the idea of being filled with wine or alcohol is one way to describe this, because when you get drunk or you start drinking a little bit too much, you really start behaving in a different way. In the same way, as the Spirit of God dwells within our lives, we should start acting, thinking, and behaving and speaking in very, very different ways. Our lives are now controlled by the influence of the Holy Spirit, and that should have ramifications for how we act, think, behave, and speak. And finally, this question about what does this mean? I hope you're able to answer that. This is the church's birthday. It's when the Spirit of God is given and descends upon the church, both collectively and individually, and sets the church forward on this incredible mission to all the nations of the world. The Spirit of God should empower our lives so that we are changed people. Be sure to hit the subscribe button down below so that you know when I post new material. Be sure to tell other people about it. And finally, after having said all that, I hope to see you all next week, and until then, peace.